One thing that I always tell my students over the years is that maps can tell a story. And in the beginning of the school year, they would laugh and say, no, books tell stories or people tell stories. But my job as a geography and history teacher was to sort of convince them by the end of the year that maps can become very powerful storytelling tools. While we say that maps tell stories, sometimes we sort of have to uncover those stories. So there's a Spanish playwright who wrote a play called The Cartographer, Warsaw, 1 to 400,000. And there's a very compelling quote. And I did not do this Spanish translation, so I'm relying on the translation skills of others. But talking about how maps make things visible and make other things invisible. And he goes on to say, if a cartographer tells you he's neutral, don't trust him. If he tells you he's neutral, you already know what side he's on because maps always take sides. They cover and discover. They give form and they deform. In Versailles, why was the cartographer the second most important man after the king? What matters to cartographers are strategic locations to control a stretch of land. They all help their owners prepare for attacks, erasing borders, replacing them with others. That's why there's always maps on powerful men's tables. Maps to scare their visitors, secret maps no one ever gets to see, new maps full of delights, old maps that stick a knife in one day and signal the start of a war. So many catastrophes, all of them started by a map. Good for cartographers, bad for humanity. And so when we think about mapping, I want you to think about a few different questions. Who created the map? What was the intended audience? What was the purpose? When was the map created? And what else do we know about this map? We have to dig into maps and ask those types of questions rather than just accepting the maps that we traditionally see in our textbooks and other educational materials. The earliest maps were oftentimes hand-drawn. This is a very famous map of John Smith, Jamestown, which we study in the history books that was discovered in 1607. But when we think about it, was Jamestown really discovered? Because there were an awful lot of indigenous people already living there. So again, while this map was created by an Englishman to take home back to England to show this awesome new place that he discovered along with his colleagues, when we really dig into the story, we realize that that's only one point of view of the story. So yes, maps can tell stories, but maps can also have lots of untold stories. Now, in your textbooks and in your teacher's syllabus, there's usually a section called the Age of Exploration. And a lot of times it's also thought of as the Age of Maps because some maps became so important to people who were traveling to the quote unquote New World that it actually became a business for people to buy these maps that were brought back by people who had been to the colonies or been to the quote unquote New World, and they began selling them. And the most profitable map most likely was John Smith's map of Virginia. Now, it was not only known for being a beautiful work of art in itself, but it also was thought to be very accurate, especially for that time period, considering that nowadays we have very digital tools and things that are very accurate in measuring. John Smith, much of his map was drawn from hand-drawn sketches and later put together. Now, this map is a little bit misleading, which is why we always have to answer questions about maps. We have to ask, when was the map made and for what purpose? So if you dig into this map, you'll see this beautiful artwork and you'll see the perspective of the English colonies. They were trying to sell this. This was a real estate deal. The Virginia Company of London spent a lot of money to send John Smith and his crew over there. So again, when we're thinking about maps, it's really important to look at who made the map, when was it made, and for what purpose, right? And so as you are looking at historic maps like the John Smith map and others, don't take everything at face value. This map is labeled 1607 up here in the top left corner, but it didn't even come out until 1612, which means John Smith had a little more time to get his act together and put all the details and features to get it just right, something he could be proud to have bought and sold. And he's selling that portion of history to us now today. So dig into the maps and ask better questions. The map you're looking at on the screen now might look a little different to you than the ones you've previously seen in your textbook. You may say, oh, this map doesn't look right, or wait, what's wrong with this map? But really, if you take a look closer, that's because we're used to, in the United States, seeing maps that sort of center North and South America on the left side of the map. But if you were a student growing up in Africa or Australia, this map would seem perfectly clear to you. I want you to think about the cartographer and the stories that they're trying to tell. Who is the audience? Who created the map and for what purpose? When we're looking at maps, we want to make sure that you're not always just thinking about things being centered around stories from North America or a Eurocentric view of mapping. Countermapping is a movement in modern cartography where people create maps trying to bring indigenous voices into the mapping space, trying to counter the Western notions of both place and geography and challenging borders previously held by Eurocentric mapmakers. I'm going to pull up a map that I'm particularly fond of that's being created in recent years. It looks like it has kind of this tissue paper effect. And if you look at it, it almost looks like layers of tissue paper overlapping. And this was created by indigenous cartographers as a way for them to map their native homelands. And what I like about it is very much like modern technology that we're using now to create maps, geographic information systems or GIS, which is based on layers of data. So if you look at the colors and the way that they're representing the different culture groups and indigenous groups as they are mapping in the modern era, they're showing over space and time migration movements of peoples across North America. Now, this map has been crowdsourced, which means indigenous cartographers from all over the world have now mapped out what started as just a map of North America onto every continent. I'm looking now at a wonderful project that we created here at the Digital Scholarship Lab at University of Richmond. Southern Journey is actually a 3-part series of story maps. So as you scroll through this map, you're able to look for patterns. You're able to see how data is represented. Here's a flat map. This looks very similar to the maps in your textbook. This is a map showing where indigenous people lived at the time when both English, Spanish, and French people were all vying to control land in what was then known as the British colonies and then later on became parts of the United States and North America. We know that there were many people living on the land largely before people came from England or France or Spain, and those were indigenous peoples. But by the mid-1800s, they're being forcibly removed off their land. And this animation shows what some people call things like the Trail of Tears or the Long Walk. Forcing indigenous people off their land didn't occur in one day or in one movement, but over a series of interruptions and forced removals. And so by using the latest technologies, being able to layer and animate these maps, we get a larger sense of just the scope of the Indian removal and the begin to grasp the ways that indigenous people were removed from places where they had been living and thriving for years so that other people moving in could take advantage of the land where they could grow crops to make an economic difference for their own selves. As this map goes on, we continue to see as the population density grows, you're going to see that more and more people, enslaved Africans, are being sent there as indigenous people continue to be removed and erased farther and farther west. So again, as you're looking at maps and you're thinking about who is telling the story, who's controlling the narrative, when you become the cartographer, when you start creating your own story maps, you need to consider the voices of everyone who is in part of the story, making sure that you are looking at resources that are going to tell accurate facts about the history of all the people who were included in that time period. It's really important that we don't erase some people out of history in order to tell the stories of others. Many of the maps that were created in the 17 and 1800s as the nation expanded do not tell the stories of all Americans. So it's up to you as the future cartographers to do a better job of telling those stories. And I hope that you'll take time to really dig into maps and explore them. You don't need to wait for your teacher to tell you everything about a map. In fact, if you're a teacher and you're watching this, I encourage you not to tell your students what you think of the map. Give them time to explore the map and see what they can find first. One thing I want to encourage you to do is to dig into your own state and local archives. Start at the local history level. If you have a local historical society that's within a decent driving distance that you and your teacher can explore, I would start there and ask if they have local maps in their collections. If not, the Library of Congress and the National Archives are a great place to start. So I would encourage you to dig into maps and, again, ask those questions. How was the map made? Who were the cartographers? When were the maps made? And for what purpose? I also wanted to show you a local project done by a group of middle school students in Southside, Virginia. They used local census data. They used historic census data. They used digital images and other archives found through their local historical society and created their own story maps and published a series of op-ed pieces in their local newspaper, and basically helped reunite families of a descendant community from their rural community. All of this was done by looking at public records and archives and mapping out the data. So they created the story maps to tell the story of Lucyville, an African-American community that had been erased for many years from history. But through the students' diligence and their mapping skills, they were able to bring the story to light. And they have now had 4 historical markers with more on the way, honoring the people and the members of the community. So I encourage you as student cartographers to get out there, dig into local archives, and tell your stories. Please share them with us. We'd love to see them.